With the S5, Panasonic are saying they have completely rewritten the autofocus algorithms used in the camera. Instead of just improving on the same source code, they've completely rewritten it from the ground up. So it may still be contrast-based autofocus, but according to Panasonic, we should treat this as a completely new system. So as soon as we got our hands on the camera, we decided to do just that. We did a bunch of controlled autofocus tests here in our showroom, mainly focused on phase detect mode, as that is the area that we found our customers use the most in their work from talking to them. And as you can see from the results here, you can definitely get smooth and reliable face tracking with minimal hunting and much less background twitching, which is a common problem with other contrast-based autofocus systems. This is the same shot filmed with an S5 and a GH5 side by side, using the new 20-60mm on the S5 and the 12-60 Leica lens on the GH5. And as you can see, both are keeping focus on George's face as he moves. Panasonic have done a great job improving the GH5 over the last few years, but I think the S5 does look that little bit more natural. The big difference though is in the twitching on those lights in the background. The GH5 twitches a lot, and the S5 nowhere near as much. In fact, this is now the same shot side by side with the Sony a7 III, which has Sony's hybrid autofocus system, and the S5 is actually holding its own remarkably well. Not bad for contrast-based autofocus at all, and an undeniable improvement. However, it's not quite as simple as that. Because the camera's only way of checking focus is detecting contrast, it does rely a lot on how much contrast it can see in your scene. It also needs to be fed information as much as possible, so we found 50 frames a second gives better results than 25. It also can become less effective when the camera has to do more processing, so in Super 35mm mode, it's better than full frame mode. So to get the best results from the camera, like those clips we just showed you, we were in 4K 50p, so the Super 35mm crop mode, and Panasonic's Leica 709 picture profile. Which is a bit of a side note, I actually really like as a quick turnaround picture profile. I think the results look great. So let's break down each of those points with some actual tests to show you what we mean. We set up a fairly evenly lit scene here so that we could repeat it for each of these tests, with a bit of good separation from the background and some highlights and fairy lights back there to make it as obvious as possible when there's any pulsing or searching from the autofocus. So the areas to look at in this test are of course George as he steps forward and back to see if it keeps focus on him, the main subject, and then the fairy lights and that lamp, as those are where any issues will be the most obvious. First up, we started with 4K 50p, which is how we got the best results with the camera. You can then see as we go to 25p with the same Super 35mm crop mode, and then 25p with the full width of the sensor, it gets that little bit progressively worse each time. This next test is comparing Vlog to Rec 709. Because the camera is relying on the contrast in your image to drive its autofocus, once you reduce that contrast right down by using log, you do start to see some more problems. And as you can see in these tests, it still does a good job, but I'd say we're back to GH5 levels of autofocus now. It's hunting that little bit more on the face to check focus, and you can see much more pulsing in the background lights. For the best autofocus, I do think it's definitely best to avoid using Vlog. Now you may have noticed in those previous tests that we had our speed and sensitivity settings set to -2 and -1 respectively. This is the first test we did with the camera, and those were the settings which we found we got the best results overall. Now this is of course a pre-production firmware model, so who knows how much this is going to change over time. It's very possible that by the time you're actually using this camera on real projects out there, I mean this could all be out of date. But let's look through the results anyway. Out of the box, the camera is set to 0, 0 here for speed and sensitivity, and it was doing a very good job of tracking George as he moves. I can't really see any hunting here either. If there is, it's very small. However, those background lights are definitely pulsing quite a bit. It's very strange how the subject can seem consistently sharp while the background is pulsing, but that does seem to be what's happening, so I'm not sure what's going on there. We then tried keeping the speed set to 0, but lowering the sensitivity to -3. And this didn't work at all. Sure, the background twitching was much less, but George wasn't in focus at all. It was far too slow to start moving to him. And sure enough, turning everything down, -5 speed, -3 sensitivity, didn't work either. Next, we kept the sensitivity at 0 and moved the speed down to -3. This was now tracking George again very well, but we still have that pulsing in the background. We then lowered the sensitivity to -1, and now the pulsing is much better. -1 definitely seems to be a sweet spot for the sensitivity setting. At -3, -2 and -1 on the speed all seem to work perfectly fine, so we settled on -2 for these tests simply because it's a bit of a middle ground. So all of these tests were with the 20 to 60mm kit lens, but we did try a few other options as well. We had a 28mm Sigma L mount prime, which is a lovely lens from Sigma, and it actually performed pretty well. You can see here there's some twitching. It's definitely not quite as good as the Panasonic lens, but it's keeping focus well on George, which is the main thing. We also tried their MC21 adapter to use EF mount lenses, which works great in all other areas, but it wouldn't give us continuous autofocus at all. A message pops up when you go into AFC mode, letting you know that you're stuck with AFS mode for single shot autofocus, but at least that does work quite well and pretty fast. We also tried a few other autofocus point selection modes, like 225 mode, single point, object tracking rather than face detect, and all of these just work fine. None of them seem to give us better performance than we were getting in face detect mode, but I suppose that's a good thing, as that face detect mode is the one after all that we find customers want to use the most. So this is only scratching the surface of the possible autofocus tests that we could do, and I'm sure once the camera starts to ship, people will push this camera much further than we have. But for now, there's two big questions to answer with this camera. Firstly, is it better than what we've seen from Panasonic's other cameras? And for me, that's a resounding yes. It definitely is. It tracks the subject reliably, and for the most part, quite smoothly. Sure, there's still some twitching, but you can really reduce that as long as you're in the right mode. Even if you do have to go to 50p crop with a Rec 709 picture profile to get the best from it, if you know that you're doing a scene where autofocus is really important in that current situation, at least you now know that you have a mode which you can go into so that the autofocus is as good as it can be. The other question is it as good as the competition? Now, both Sony and Canon are using a mixture of contrast-based and phase detect autofocus technology. And sure, they each do things in their own way, they've each got their own little quirks, but the final result now, both on Canon and on Sony, is pretty similar. The autofocus performance does a better job than I would normally do myself manually, especially for tracking faces in interviews and piece-to cameras like this one. And as much as Panasonic have improved the contrast-based autofocus here, it's still not quite as good. It can be nearly there if you're in 4K 50p Rec 709, but people don't want to have their record modes dictated by something like autofocus performance. I'd say full frame 25p in Vlog would be a much more popular format choice for interviews than 4K 50p in APS-C crop. But if you choose 4K 25p Vlog, you know that autofocus won't be as good. Here's the S5 side by side with the A7 III from Sony, but rather than being in 4K 50p Rec 709 like the last time we showed you this comparison, both cameras are now using full frame at 25 frames a second using each of their own log formats. And the Sony performs exactly the same as it did before, while the S5 is pulsing in the background considerably more. At the end of the day though, this camera is about far more than just its autofocus. In all other aspects, it's a very practical and sensible camera. The autofocus, after all, is only one piece of the puzzle, and we need to remember that. Sometimes with cameras, I've just recommended that customers never even turn autofocus on because it's just going to let them down. And I don't think this is one of those cameras. For some situations where some pulsing in the background every now and again isn't a big deal, it's not going to bother anyone, this will be perfectly fine. But also for some situations, it's just not going to be reliable enough and people won't use it or trust it. Now, I love using autofocus, and I'm very pleased that Panasonic have made improvements here, and I do think that it's enough of a change now to mean that people should put to one side their previous experiences with past Lumix cameras and give this new system a fair chance. But contrast-based autofocus is still contrast-based autofocus, and no matter how much you perfect it, it looks like it's still not as effective as a hybrid system at the end of the day. So, do you think it's now good enough in terms of autofocus for you to start using it in your own work? Let me know what you think of the autofocus performance in the S5 in the comment section down below. And if you want to buy one for yourself, then of course, just head over to proav.co.uk. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.